And again, thank you so much to all of you who are joining us at the lunchtime hour or whatever hour it is, wherever time zone you are in the world. We have folks from several time zones already on the call, and I'm sure that many people from around the world are joining us across the US and around the world for this very special webinar on torture and the death penalty as part of the 20th anniversary of World Day Against the Death Penalty. My name is David Brazil. I'm the Executive Director of Death Penalty Focus, and I'm very honored to be here with our guests for the day, Mike Farrell, as well as Professor Juan Mendez. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We are going to keep to an hour, so we're going to be thoughtful in our use of time. So we're going to let folks who join late and miss this introductory stuff, which is okay because we'll be hearing shortly from our featured speakers, which is really why y'all are here. But I do want to welcome y'all. I want to let you know about the work of Death Penalty Focus, which is hosting this event. Death Penalty Focus is the principal advocacy organization for the abolition of the death penalty in California. Death Penalty Focus has been holding this work down for decades, has been key in attempts to repeal and abolish the death penalty in California, as well as educating people in California, in the US, and internationally about this inhumane practice, which must end. And so this is part of our ongoing work of education to share with folks the character of the death penalty, its implication in torture in this case, but also its racism, its wastefulness, and its cruelty. So we're really excited that all of you can join us today and hope you're also benefiting from the many other events that are going on from partner organizations in the US and around the world around the death penalty today. So in terms of the event today, we are going to be proceeding with the webinar format. And if you want to give a question to the speakers, you can put that in the Q&A, and our indefatigable support staff, Mary Kate, will help answer the questions. And after we have some time of introduction and comments from Mike and Professor Mendez, we will spend the last part of our time together, the last third of our time together in conversation around the issues that have been raised by the presenters. It's important that I urge that we all be civil and respectful. There are differences of views about the issues we'll talk about, but we are not going to tolerate any abusive language or profanity. And if you do use that kind of abusive language or profanity, you will be ejected from the webinar. So just want to make sure that everybody knows that we're keeping it civil here. Really excited for everybody. I see that we're almost 100 people have joined. I'm really excited to be able to thank our co-sponsors. I'm going to put up their logos real quick if I can figure out my Zoom. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge our co-sponsors who are from all over the country. We have Witness to Innocence, we have the Santa Maria NAACP, we have the Fund for Santa Barbara, California People of Faith Working Against the Death Penalty, the Eighth Amendment Project, Exonerated Nation, Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Amnesty International's Local Group 30 out of San Francisco, Death Penalty Action, as well as Fair and Just Prosecution. So we're really grateful to all of these co-sponsoring groups for helping us to co-present this webinar, sharing this with their lists, and just being part of the struggle with us. We know that we're not going to be able to abolish the death penalty in California and beyond without everybody coming together to do it. So thank you all for that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our featured speakers, starting with Mike Farrell, who is our president of Death Penalty Focus. So Mike is also a spokesperson for Concern America, an international refugee aid and development organization, co-chair emeritus of the California Committee of Human Rights Watch, and occasionally a Goodwill ambassador for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. A refugee aid and human rights activist for over 35 years. In the late 90s with Human Rights Watch, he took part in a mission to the US-Mexico border areas, investigating claims of abuse against the undocumented by US Border Patrol agents. And in 1999, again with a Human Rights Watch investigator, he toured and interviewed prisoners at McAllister State Prison in Oklahoma, with particular attention to its segregation and death row facility, the infamous H Unit. I also want to welcome Professor Juan Mendez, who's with us from Geneva, Switzerland today. So braving a big time difference from California, and really grateful for his presence. Professor Juan E. Mendez was the Special Rapporteur at the United Nations from November 2010 to October 31st, 2016. He is currently Faculty Director of the Anti-Torture Initiative at American University, Washington College of Law. Professor Mendez is a native of Argentina, where he dedicated his legal career to the defense of human rights. As a result of his work representing political prisoners, he was arrested by the Argentinian military dictatorship and spent more than a year in prison, where he was tortured. He was expelled from Argentina in 1977 and moved to the United States. He has worked at Human Rights Watch, the American Institute of Human Rights in Costa Rica, and Notre Dame University's Center for Civil Rights and Human Rights. He has taught law at Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, and Oxford. So we're really grateful to be able to welcome these two amazing speakers and presenters. And we are going to go ahead and invite opening comments from each of them on today's theme, which again is torture and the death penalty. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Farrell for opening comments on torture and the death penalty.
Thank you, David, and thank you all in attendance. I appreciate your being with us. I simply want to say that I'm honored to be in the company of Juan Mendez. Juan and I met initially when he was a researcher, investigator for America's Watch, which then ultimately became Human Rights Watch. I was involved with them in Central America in the early 80s. The work he has done following him, as David mentioned, Special Rapporteur for the UN on torture. I believe Juan is the one who did the report or the research that established the fact that the United Nations has now proclaimed over 15 days for a person in sole custody I've lost the term.
Solitary confinement.
I'm sorry, what?
Solitary confinement.
Solitary, thank you, in solitary confinement. Over 15 days in solitary confinement does lasting, if not permanent, psychological damage. And moving on from there, one has been quite extraordinary. We met, and as we've just been discussing, in Costa Rica at a meeting of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, when he was there representing one organization and I was there for DPF. Juan is, if I may embarrass him just a bit, a personal hero of mine, and I'm thrilled to be able to spend this time with him on this very important subject. And I guess I want to say that for a civilized society, it ought to be clear to all of us that punishment means the restriction of liberty, not the infliction of pain. And that, it seems to me, is the bottom line when we come to the idea of people actually inflicting torture on human beings. Thank you, Juan. I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Mike. Juan, please go ahead.
Well, certainly there's a very clear case that the death penalty always amounts to torture, because although international human rights law traditionally has made an exception for so-called pain and suffering incidental to regularly imposed sanctions. In a report I did as a special rapporteur on torture, precisely on this topic, I argued that there's just no way that the death penalty can be imposed and executed without crossing the line into torture, that is pain and suffering deliberately inflicted for a number of reasons, and also inflicted by the state. The reason is, I think, that there's no way in which any mode of execution of the death penalty does not create at least an instantaneous form of pain and suffering. But in addition, the way the death penalty is imposed and then executed around the world where it still exists, is accompanied by a long, long period of mental torture in the sense of not knowing when this will come to an end, or whether, in fact, you're going to be subjected to capital punishment or not. And as Mike was saying, and for the most part, the months and years and sometimes decades spent in death row are almost always spent in solitary confinement. And as Mike said, in 2015, the international community amended the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners and established, now called the Nelson Mandela rules, and established that any period of time beyond 15 days and any indefinite solitary confinement amounts to torture. So I think we are well on our way to having some form of actual abolition of torture, if not in our lifetime, at least maybe in the lifetime of our children or grandchildren, because I think the world is moving towards abolition. We all wish that it would happen a lot sooner, but I think treating the death penalty as torture will probably accelerate the process, or at least that's to be hoped for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendez. And I wonder, for those who are not familiar with your work, if you would be willing to speak about some of your experiences in Argentina, both as representing people who are confronting or suffered torture, as well as your own experience of incarceration.
Yeah, well, thank you. This was a long time ago, but I still remember it. I was just fresh out of law school, and or even before finishing law school, I started working with people who were, mistreated by the system generally. And these were pretty turbulent years. And so many, although I wanted to be a labor lawyer, for the most part, I did criminal law, and I defended people accused of subversive activities, etc. And with other colleagues, we actually found and discovered places of torture in my hometown, Mar del Plata. And, we had the justice system search them and open investigations. But it was clear that that was not enough to stop torture. It did protect some people. At least we made the period of torture shorter if we could. But the situation deteriorated much faster than we had expected. And in my case, I was relatively lucky that I was arrested when there was no system of disappearance of persons, because many of the colleagues and friends who did this work with me that represented political prisoners or denounced torture are now counted among the disappeared. But in my case, it was imprisonment and torture, pretty brutally, with electric shock mostly. But again, most of the people that were in my very same situation, that is in administrative detention without punishment, without having been even prosecuted or much less convicted, many of them spent 4 or 5 up to 8 years in prison. And in my case, because of international pressure, I was able to reduce it to 1.5 years. But of course, I left and couldn't go back to Argentina until the democracy was restored, which nowadays, at that time, it seemed endless, the dictatorship, but it's not, and it was not. And now we have had more than 40 years of democracy in Argentina, and God knows we have all kinds of problems. But one thing we don't have is coups d'etat anymore.
Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate that. And I guess I have a question for both of you, both having worked with survivors of torture. What are the long-term consequences of torture for survivors? And what can we as communities do to support healing of individuals and of communities when torture has happened?
Please, Juan, you're You're the expert in this area.
Well, I've interviewed many people who have been tortured, and really the long-term consequences depend on so many factors that it's almost impossible to say this is what's going to happen for the rest of your life. I remember sitting at a court in San Francisco where an expert psychologist was describing the torture that suffered by an Argentine who was filing a lawsuit against the only general from Argentina that jumped ship and was found in San Francisco. And before his extradition to Argentina, several of us, including Human Rights Watch, we filed an alien tort statute claim against him. And in the course of a hearing with this General Suarez Mason present, this psychologist from Harvard was saying that with what had happened to one of our plaintiffs, and it was more or less the same thing that had happened to me, it could be predicted that he had lost 15 years of his life. He would die 15 years earlier than not, and he would have issues of impotence and things like that. And I kind of panicked. I didn't say that to anybody, but I'm glad to say that it hasn't happened to me, or at least the loss of 15 years hasn't happened to me. So I really don't know. I think the long-term effects are always going to be there. Sometimes you'll have nightmares, and sometimes you'll just remember things. But I don't know if you're more affected by the loss of friends and family and colleagues and comrades in the struggle than for what exactly happened to you. In my case, the long-term effect is that I've become an advocate for the abolition of torture, just like I'm an advocate for the abolition of the death penalty.
Let me just add, if I may, that to the people with whom I've dealt who have been on death row or are currently on death row, suffer from what I think is intended by the court. Once the court says you are sentenced to death, you become a non-person, and there's a diminishment of the human aspect of that person. You become a number. At best, you become a name, but it's a single name. And as Juan said, solitary confinement is a result of this for God knows how long. We have cases of people been in solitary confinement, not necessarily death penalty people, but for 4 decades. I find myself stunned at the fact that normal human beings on the other side of the law, the guards in these situations, can and do participate in this process in a way that is continually dehumanizing and diminishing the individual, and the impact of that, psychologically at least, has to be long term.
Let me add, since we're talking about solitary confinement, one person that I interviewed in Pelican Bay in the context of another lawsuit, a class action to challenge the way solitary confinement was used in California at the time. And this man told me the fact that we can cope doesn't mean that we don't suffer. And that I thought was very revealing, because of course the authorities were saying, this has no long-term effect. We monitor these people, and whenever they have any health problem, even mental health problem, we take them out of there and we treat them, etc. But the point is that it's still pain and suffering, and it's and it is possible for people to cope, but that doesn't excuse the rest of us from letting this state of affairs continue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Mendez. And Mike, a question for you, since you've done so much work with death penalty focus, but also in the international picture, what do you think American abolitionists have to learn from the international struggles against torture, the death penalty, solitary confinement, this host of issues?
Well, unfortunately, we think of ourselves as the leading nation in the world, and as a result, we don't feel, I think, the need to learn from the rest of the world. And that's a grievous fault on our part. When I go to other parts of the world and have investigated circumstances, what I find is that there is a keen awareness on the parts of many, many people of the value of their own integrity, of the value of their own lives, that simply is snuffed out, or the intention of solitary confinement and the death penalty is to snuff out this sense of the value of a human being. So what we have to do, I think, is open ourselves to the idea that we are not leading in the world of human rights, for example. We are not meeting the standards that are expected of participants in an organized and thoughtful and humane world. We, as one of the leading nations in the world, or in many indisputable ways, are failing ourselves and the community of nations by continuing the practice of long-term solitary confinement and the death penalty, all of which is, as Juan said, associated with torture.
Absolutely. Can I ask either of you to share specific areas that folks might not know about where the U.S. is lagging in the international norms that we'd like to see around any of these issues? I know it's a long list.
I don't think there's that much respect for the United States as a human rights leader, not so much on the death penalty, but certainly after 9/11 and the torture memos and extraordinary renditions and Guantanamo and all of that. The rest of the world looks to the United States for many things, but not for human rights. And in respect to the death penalty, I have to say that the international community looks to more progressive and more enlightened countries, but it does, and I am a witness to that, it does look to the United States civil society for the struggle against the death penalty. The death penalty still exists in a number of other countries, but there is no comparison with the level of dedication and good legal work and advocacy in favor of the families of people in death row that characterizes the struggle against the death penalty in the United States. So in that sense, at least the civil society of the United States is a leader, certainly against the death penalty.
I like that idea. Unfortunately, this beacon of hope and this city on a hill, the kind of idealist vision of America and the premises of this country are stirring, heart-stirring, and wonderful and hopeful, and yet we fail in so many instances to achieve them, to live up to them. That's the thing that I find so distressing. When we have a leader of the United States, elected leader of the United States, that talks about shithole countries out there in the world, I think it doesn't respond. It doesn't build up our stature in the rest of the world, and it sets us apart in a way that allows us, I believe, to feel some of us to feel okay about some of the other ways in which we are failing to live up to those standards.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I wonder, we've talked a bit about the death penalty as torture, sort of vis-a-vis solitary confinement and other issues. I wonder if either of you would like to share about the way that the implementation of the death penalty is itself torture. And I'm looking at the sort of ongoing idea that lethal injection, for example, is somehow more humane when studies make it clear that in fact, there's a great deal of suffering involved with lethal injection. But is there anything that either of you would like to share about the actual implementation of forms of capital punishment as torture?
Well, that's what I meant about modes of execution, because there are some modes of execution that have been abandoned by humanity. For example, stoning, beheading, crucifixion. But the illusion that there are some forms of execution that are more humane than others is that it's an illusion. Even with the lethal injection, we don't see what the suffering is, because part of the lethal injection just paralyzes the person. And so we don't know whether they're suffering or not. And by the way, we've seen examples of error, quote unquote, in which people suffer for half an hour or more, and then we have to stop and start all over again. So there's just no formula for modes of execution that do not cross the line into cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, or even torture. So that's an argument, because if a country wants to retain the death penalty, but is also a signatory of the Convention Against Torture, and even if it's not a signatory, because all of the provisions in the Convention Against Torture are customary international law, they cannot have it both ways. They cannot have the death penalty and not be in violation of their obligations against torture in international law. But the other side of the problem is the road from prosecution for capital offenses to actual execution. And as I said, not only in the United States, just about everywhere that I know, that the death penalty is accompanied by years and sometimes decades of solitary confinement, and in some places in horrendous conditions. So there's torture not only in the execution, but also in the process by which we get to capital punishment.
It's interesting when you think of the progress, if you could call it that, in this country to move from hanging and from the original methods to do away with a miscreant. They have been, each one of them has been used and thought of as the answer, whether it's electric chair, gas, or it's firing squad. Each time the makers of the laws continue to insist that there is a way to do it that's within the realm of not unacceptable, not too much cruel and usual treatment. But we now find with this lethal injection process, for example, that has been determined to be the most today the most acceptable form, in which almost every killing state now, almost every killing state uses it. The term botched executions has become a regular description because of the fact that you simply cannot go through the process of ending a human life without harming, not only, in my view, the people that are being executed, but also the people that are doing the execution.
Yeah, that's a great thing to bring up, Mike. And I know that you have interacted with folks who have been involved in the execution process. Do either of you have anything you'd like to share about that side of things, the impact on those who do the killing work of the state, and what that looks like for them in the long term, the impacts there?
There was a quite powerful interview and report done, I think a year or so ago, about three men, two of whom were executioners, and one in one of the southern states, and one was not the executioner, but the person directly in charge of and responsible for the maintenance of the system. And they talked at some length about the one man said, I feel as though I've been condemned by God for having taken part in this process. But I did it because it was my job. And the job was understood to be what it was, and it was recognized and appreciated, my doing this, by people I would venture to guess weren't the ones that were happy that he was doing it rather than they. Many years ago, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, I believe his name is Jeremy Rush, I'm not sure of his first name, said that he founded the Pennsylvania Prison Project, and he wrote that he opposed the capital punishment as he opposed slavery, but he opposed capital punishment because he found it brutalizing. And what he meant by the brutalization that involved with capital punishment is not only that it brutalizes the person who is being executed, but it brutalizes those who do the executing. It brutalizes those who are part of the process. And I think if you extrapolate that out, those who are part of the process in a society that is determined the way ours is by the will of the people, we are all being brutalized by continuing this process.
Absolutely. Professor Mendez, do you have anything to add on that topic?
No, not on that. I don't remember having had any discussion with people who were part of the killing process, but it is a very interesting story, Mike, and it would be very important to share it if you can.
Thank you, Juan.
Thank you both so much. And, you know, I come from a background as an organizer and an activist. So my question when we're confronted with powerful and painful material like this is always, what are the steps that we can take as individuals and communities to fight against torture, against the death penalty, against solitary confinement, these interconnected things in the US and internationally? So I would love to hear either from Mike or Professor Mendez or both. What do you think are the best things that we can do individually and collectively to fight these evils?
Well, Mike has much more experience than me in organizing grassroots appeals against the death penalty. But I think, just joining the abolitionist proposals in different legislatures and campaigning every time there is a coming execution, and particularly making sure that the federal government leads the way into abolition of the death penalty, which is now back on the law books for federal crimes. I think we've come. We should be encouraged that, if I understand it correctly, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but the death penalty is executed at about half the rate that it was in the United States 10 or 20 years ago. So there is a decline, and if there is a decline, it's because of the effect of civil society organizing and campaigning on each individual case, moving the powers that be either to not execute the death penalty or not call for the death penalty in a prosecution and trial. So I think we should take some encouragement from the fact that we are moving in the right direction, but not to any point of complacency, of course. I also think that worldwide, the death penalty is also on the decline. More than half of the nations in the world have agreed to the moratorium that the United Nations called for or asked for. And although there's been some backtracking there as well, like India started executing again after 20 or 25 years of not executing anybody. And there's countries like China that we don't know how many they execute a year. there's still some sense in which the international community is moving in the right direction, and we need to, push in that direction as well.
Let me add, to be a member of a civilized society, which I think we are, requires being a responsible citizen. And being a responsible citizen means to take responsibility for those things that are both beneficial to society and hurtful to society. I think for all of us as citizens, looking around at what we are doing and what we're not doing, and how we can expand the positive and eliminate, or at least diminish the negative, is very important. I was in Oklahoma. I was asked to come to help stop an execution. After meeting with the governor, we were unable to stop the execution. We went to the prison almost 30 years ago. We went to the prison and met this young man, Robin Parks. I want to say his name because that's important. Robin thanked us for coming. We told him we had failed. And I'll never forget, when he thanked me, he put his hand up on the glass, as is the traditional way to which people say thank you, goodbye, hello, whatever. And I put my hand up on the glass as well. And then he walked away and they killed him. And the next day, I got a call from somebody associated with his lawyer who had been with him up until the last moment. And he said he wanted to thank me for showing up. And all I can tell you is, because I failed, I felt, doing saving his life, which was the intention. But the idea that he expressed gratitude to me for showing up meant that what I need to tell everybody else is, it's important that you show up in whatever way you can. Show up.
Very well put, Mike. Thank you so much. And at Death Penalty Focus, we're trying to make sure that you all have good, clear ways that you can show up. I'm going to share at the end some action opportunities for that. But before we get onto that, we want to make some time for your thoughts. We see we have 125 people on the webinar, which is terrific. And I'm sure after this wonderful presentation with so many different elements, you all probably have questions that you would like to ask the panelists. So please go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A, and we will go ahead and get some questions asked to the panelists. And I'll read one that was put during the conversation. This is from Andrea Ball. Could either of the panelists discuss what can be done to stop the incidents like the botched execution of Joe Nathan James and Alan Miller? Can we as citizens call on our states to be more transparent about what takes place before the curtain is opened? So the theme of botched executions, which we talked about vis-a-vis lethal injection. Do either of you have thoughts on this question about what can we do about the phenomenon of the botched execution?
I think the questioner is talking about Alabama. And I think what has to be done is to demand, not just simply ask for, but demand more openness in the process. That's the case. One of them is the case where the man was held outside the viewing area where these lethal injections usually take place before a panel of witnesses. But he was held outside because of a problem, and nobody knew what the problem was. It turns out he was held outside for, I think it was over an hour. Actually, may have been more than an hour. More than 2 hours. Whatever the time, it turns out that they were trying unsuccessfully to find veins that could, through which they could inject the poison. And in this process, they went into his arms and his legs and his groin and every other place they could think of. And clearly not significantly or successfully trained people killed this man and tortured him before doing so.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Other folks, please go ahead and add your questions to the Q&A. We would be glad to commend them to the speakers if you have a question about that, anything that we've been talking about. We have fielded conversations about the impact on staff who administer executions. There's a question in the chat. This is from Jane Courant. How do we influence those in power that commutation of the death penalty sentence to life without parole, LWOP, is death by incarceration, another form of torture? So in terms of extreme sentences like LWOP, where does that fit into the conversation? This is from Jane Courant. So that's to either panelist.
Well, I'd love to hear from you, what you think, Juan, about that before I talk about it.
If it's a question of we're still on modes of execution, again, there's no reasonable argument that can be made that any form of execution does not entail some pain and suffering, and that some pain and suffering amounts to torture. It's pretty much indisputable. Not sure if I understood the rest of the question, though.
The questioner was speaking about what we call LWOP in America, life without parole.
Right. Well, I know there is a movement towards abandoning imprisonment or the carceral state, as some call it, that life without parole is itself a mode of at least mental torture. I think in those situations, we need to keep our eyes on the prize and try to get to abolition, in fact, of torture, of the death penalty. And if there is a substitute for it that can be called life without parole, that should not stop us from insisting on, abolishing the death penalty as it is now. And then we can find a way of, campaigning against life without parole or against very prolonged sentences of all sorts. But quite frankly, I don't think strategically it's sound to, be against all forms of punishment when in fact what we need to do is at least stop the killing machine.
Very interesting. Thank you, Juan. We at Death Penalty Focus are in the throes of just this very discussion. I personally oppose life without parole. Many of our board members, I think, agree, while others have some concerns. So what we have to look at is extreme punishment, and whether or not extreme punishment is something that we as a society are willing to tolerate, and the effects of which can be quite extraordinarily brutal.
Right. One thing that life without parole and the death penalty have in common is that both eliminate the possibility of rehabilitation. And prison, if it has any noble purpose, is to rehabilitate and to give everybody a second chance. And I would not deny even my worst enemy a second chance. And so in that sense, I tend to agree with you. I was just making only the strategic point that, since we cannot accomplish all of this at the same time, it's, we should concentrate on abolition of the death penalty and then find ways of campaigning against life without parole.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendez. Really appreciate your thoughtfulness on that. And I wanted to read from the comments from Sonny Jacobs. Watching and waiting is torture for the prisoner and for the families. Watching your friends being taken away to be executed is torture, which goes back to what Mike was sharing before. We have a question from Stephen Rohde. Have any UN agencies or human rights organizations publicly or officially identified the death penalty as torture? So has the death penalty been identified as torture? A good point of fact question.
Well, certainly certain UN sanctioned bodies have. As I said, when I was a special rapporteur on torture, and my predecessors as well had done it before me, we condemned the death penalty as a form of torture. And when I published that report, my colleague who was a special rapporteur on summary and arbitrary executions, the late Christoph Heinz, unfortunately, he died prematurely a few years ago. He also published simultaneously a report from the perspective of summary and arbitrary executions, and argued for the elimination of the death penalty, if for no other reason because the death penalty does not permit us to correct judicial errors. And if it's so final, so definitive, that the system itself cannot correct itself. And so for that in Christoph's argument was the arbitrariness of the death penalty. And so those are two examples, but the Committee Against Torture, which is the implementing body and authoritative interpreter of the Convention Against Torture, which, by the way, the United States is a party to that treaty, has also come out against the death penalty from the perspective of it being torture. Now, what we don't have is a treaty that abolishes the death penalty because it's torture. So we are in the midst of interpretations, some binding and some less binding or non-binding at all. But yes, the United Nations is very much against the death penalty. I mean, for example, when the United Nations creates tribunals like for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, it specifically eschews the death penalty and says the death penalty will not be applied even to the worst of those genocidal killers.
If I may, to backtrack just a moment, one of the arguments, one of the most telling arguments for those who care to listen, is the entrapment, the wrongful conviction, entrapment, and killing of innocent people. And when you read the thing from Sonny Jacobs, I think just a moment ago, David, I think it's important for people to know that Sonny Jacobs is an exoneree from death row. She was on death row in Florida for a great number of years, and her husband was also was executed, and it's quite infamous as the execution because I believe they used the electric chair and his head burst into flames as he was dying. And Sonny, once an investigation was done by a friend and proven that both of them were innocent of the crime, Sonny was released. So these are the kinds of hideous aspects of this practice that too few people know about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. And those of us who work professionally in the field know that many people have been exonerated. And so the horrifying specter of executing innocent people is all too real and has certainly happened, because we can infer from the number of people who are exonerees that there are some that were not caught. And as we heard from Professor Mendez, citing the research, the finality of the death penalty means that no subsequent judicial review is adequate to bring somebody back to life once they have been murdered by the state. So these are really important themes to touch on. I also wanted to read a comment from Donna Larson, whose son is incarcerated. All of your comments are so true to fact, and those same feelings and sensations are felt by the families of the inmate victim. It is so important for people to be with the inmate families on the day or night of an execution or killing. I have sat with the families at San Quentin on the outside on the night of the state killing. So there's also important to surface, as we've touched on, the impact of families of this practice and the society as a whole. As Mike has intimated, this practice degrades us all in a civilized society by being done in our names. But those who are confronting the death penalty are also, are not just themselves, but also their families are dealing with this. So thank you, Donna, for that comment. I see a question from Ann Barron, another kind of point of information. Who defines torture? And that would probably be helpful for people who are not specialists in this area to know about. I could turn that over to either of you.
I think Juan's the expert in that area.
Well, the definition of torture is in Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture. And I may not remember all the elements, although I teach it all the time. So it is the deliberate, so it has to be intentional. And there's no question that the death penalty is always intentional, obviously. But the deliberate infliction of pain and suffering by a state agent or with the tolerance or acquiescence of a state agent for purposes such as interrogation or obtaining a confession or obtaining information from others or for punishment. It can be either physical or moral or mental. So psychological torture is very much torture if you meet the qualifications that I was just mentioning. There is an element of severity, the severity of pain and suffering, and it can be for various purposes, but the list of purposes is open-ended because the definition says also that it includes any other purpose that has a discriminatory intent. And so the purposes are not that important. The intentionality is very important. And if we inflict pain and suffering for knowing that it'll make somebody suffer mentally or physically, then we are in the presence of torture. And the definition goes beyond the criminal justice system because it can be, for example, in some medical practices where there's really no medical necessity for it. So the definition is broad, and rightly so. What we try to abolish with the Convention Against Torture is any way in which a state agent or with the tolerance of a state agent, we are inflicting pain and suffering on somebody else.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendez. And I think this is a good time to transition to sort of what we can do and how we can become part of the movement to end the torture of the death penalty in California, in the US, and worldwide. Before I do that, I just want to thank Mike Farrell and Professor Juan Mendez for giving so generously of their time and expertise. Really grateful to you both for being here and sharing so much and teaching so much about these important issues. And I hope that we all come away with an understanding of the interconnection of torture, of the death penalty, of solitary confinement, and their stakes for all of us, wherever we may live. In terms of actions to become part of, definitely encourage you, if you are not already part of Death Penalty Focus's mailing list, to go to our website, deathpenalty.org, and join our mailing list, get our newsletter, and learn, keep up to date and abreast of the different support projects that are going on for people who are facing the death penalty in the US. And for those of you who are on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, please follow us on those media, and we will definitely share with you the many action opportunities that exist. DPF works closely with not just people in California, but with organizations in the currently executing states who are doing solidarity campaigns with folks who are confronting imminent execution. So if you would like to learn about how to sign petitions, how to get involved in direct actions, or otherwise how to intervene and make your voice heard on these issues for folks who are facing executions imminently, definitely encourage you to follow our social media. And you will also get a communication after this webinar that just a thank you with more follow-up information for you. Lastly, I'm going to go ahead and put my contact information in the chat. Again, my name is David Brazil. I'm the Executive Director of Death Penalty Focus. We're a small organization, so I'm also the lead organizer for all practical purposes. So I would love to hear from you. If you were moved by this webinar, if you care about this issue, if you want to figure out how to get plugged in, there's always space to get involved. You can get in where you fit in. It can be small, it can be big. DPF has developed chapters across California, and we're going to be rejuvenating our chapters once more in the new year. So if you are in California and would like to be involved in our work, if you would like to support people on death row in California and support advocacy and organizing, I would love to hear from you. So those are many ways that you can plug in. I want to give an opportunity for Mike and Professor Mendez to share any final remarks before we bring the webinar to a close.
Well, let me be the first to go on this. I really appreciated the invitation. I thought the questions were very thoughtful. Not only your questions, David, but those from the audience as well. And so it has been a privilege for me to join you and Mike in this webinar. I hope we'll have more, and we'll be able to celebrate some victories in this struggle in the near future. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mendez.
Juan, again, it has been a pleasure and an honor to spend time with you, to learn from you, and to simply make contact once again. And Juan mentioned earlier the progress that has been shown. We have reduced the number of executions in this country. I think it's important for people to understand that 23 of the 50 states of the Union have done away with the death penalty, do not have a death penalty. And 4, in addition, have a moratoria on the death penalty, including California. So we are now arguably in the majority in terms of non-killing states. And there are still states inside the Union that have the death penalty on the books, but don't use it. So we have to be aware of the fact that this system is dying, and that I can't think of anything more appropriate for this system than to be put away and buried, because we are better than this, and having people in our world like Professor Mendez and all of you who have been paying attention, and the David and the staff at DPF, I am grateful to you all for your participation.
Thank you so much, Mike. I think those are great words to end on. Again, much appreciation to Professor Juan Mendez and Mike Farrell for their participation in this, to all of you for attending. This has been our webinar. We will be sending out links to the recording. So if you have friends and family who were not able to attend but want to learn about these issues, that'll be available for circulation. But thank you so much. Please check out our website, our social media, and feel free to write me directly as I put that in the chat. And otherwise, have a great day, and we'll be in touch soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.